Welcome to Crossroads. The steel industry is facing too much supply and tumbling prices. Now look, much of this problem is coming from China, where the CCP's policies have led to overcapacity. And facing this problem, the United States has placed tariffs on Chinese goods, including steel and aluminum, which the Chinese Communist Party has in turn tried to get around by using Mexico as a waypoint into the U.S. market. But the U.S. is now looking to close this loophole that the Chinese Communist Party is using on steel. In fact, last month, U.S. President Biden and Mexican President López Obrador announced in a joint statement that they are taking key measures to protect the North American steel and aluminum markets from unfair trade practices. Now look, these key measures include improving the transparency of the origin of its imports, with Mexico requiring importers to provide more information about the country of origin of steel products. And not only that, the United States will implement melt and pour and smelt and cast requirements, respectively, for certain steel and aluminum imports from Mexico in order for those steel and aluminum imports to enter the United States tariff-free. Now, there's a bit more on this from the Epoch Times. They say that estimates suggest that 3.8 million tons of steel arrived in the United States from Mexico in 2023. 87% of the steel is melted and poured in North America, although 13% is melted and poured outside the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which is the main concern among these officials. Now, Leo Brennard, the director of the National Economic Council, said in a press call that, quote, "These actions fix a major loophole," adding that countries like China are using it to avoid U.S. tariffs by shipping their products through Mexico. And added, quote, "China is simply too big to play by its own rules." Now, you might remember why President Biden put tariffs on Chinese steel in the first place, and this goes back to May 14th. White House said in a statement that President Biden says, "American workers and businesses can outcompete anyone as long as they have fair competition. But for too long, China's government has used unfair, non-market practices," and notes that China's forced technology transfer, meaning they steal our intellectual property and also intellectual property theft, have contributed to its control of 70, 80, and even 90% of global production for the critical inputs necessary for our technologies, infrastructure, energy, and healthcare, creating unacceptable risks to American supply chains and economic security. In other words, the CCP has rigged the game in its favor, and by cheating, by stealing, they've then created monopolies on some of the key industries feeding into the surface industries. The CCP got there using theft, essentially, and after doing so, then undercut all the competition, put a lot of them out of business, and now they control that. The U.S. and other countries are now pushing back on this. Notably, a lot of this also started under Trump, where he was talking about American steel, right? This is now continued. The White House adds that furthermore, these same non-market policies and practices contribute to China's growing overcapacity and export surges that threaten to significantly harm American workers, businesses, and communities. Further on, they state that to encourage China to eliminate its unfair trade practices regarding technology transfer. In other words, they steal it, they reverse engineer it or whatever else, and then build it domestically. Also, intellectual property and innovation. They say the President, Biden, is directing increases in tariffs across strategic sectors such as steel and aluminum, semiconductors, electric vehicles, batteries, critical minerals, solar cells, ship-to-shore cranes, and medical products. Now, they also note that there's unfair practices when it comes to overcapacity, and the CCP, by overproducing certain materials, really because they were anticipating dominating a lot of these surface markets, they have too much of it on store, and what that has done is it's caused, of course, a type of, again, monopoly on the global market, where the CCP, having too much, is dumping these onto the market, driving prices down, and if they allow this to take place, it will put a lot of American and European and other countries, manufacturing the same products out of business. Steel and aluminum are two of the big ones here. Because remember as well, steel and aluminum, you don't have steel beams just sitting on your shelf, right? These tend to be products that are used for the production of other things. They're within the supply chains. And so if you control the materials that are needed to construct these surface level goods, then you control the surface level markets. The Chinese Communist Party has been trying to do this. The US and other countries are pushing back on it. Now, it also adds that China's policies and subsidies for their domestic steel and aluminum industries mean high-quality, low-emission U.S. products are undercut by artificially low-priced Chinese alternatives produced with higher emissions. Remember, they're tying a lot of this to global warming and stuff. Now, notably as well, when they talk about the CCP subsidizing these products, that's a whole other issue that's important here. Because unlike a lot of other companies within the free market, China, being a communist country, tends to subsidize a lot of these products. Most of these businesses have a kind of public-private relationship with the CCP. The CCP controls oftentimes their shares to a certain extent, meaning they're at least partially government-owned. And because they get money from the government, they don't need to fairly compete in the actual, free market capitalist market. Meaning they can charge below cost oftentimes, which then means that companies in the US or Europe or elsewhere, they can't compete on it. What the CCP does is it cuts costs so low that nobody else can compete, puts all their competition out of business, steals their innovation and so on, feeds it into its markets, and then uses that to just put everyone else out of business. It creates monopolies, and then once it controls the market, it then uses that, one, to, again, raise prices because then there's no one to challenge them, but also as a way to even, carry out diplomacy with other countries, threatening to cut them off from some of these materials if they say things the CCP doesn't like. And so business on this level is not just purely business for the CCP. Business is also political. Now, what's also interesting about this is it doesn't just point to overcapacity, having too much on store. Instead, it points to the overall problems with the CCP's unfair trade practices. Now, with all these in place, the CCP has been using various methods to try and get around these tariffs, right? Because the United States, as we just mentioned, has tried putting a stop to these types of practices of the Chinese Communist Party. On the semiconductors, then, the Chinese Communist Party has established an entire supply chain to get around the tariffs. And with steel in particular, it's the same thing. With this, that's where Mexico comes into play. Because remember, right, in that joint statement between the US and Mexico, if steel companies want to avoid tariffs on their products that are coming through Mexico, they have to prove the origin of the products now. Meaning, again, what they're essentially doing is this. They're having it so that if you want to sell steel through Mexico, you now have to verify it was actually smelted and everything else in Mexico. Meaning Mexico can't just import it from China or other countries and then sell it into the US if they want to do it without having tariffs. Because Mexico is one of the countries that has an exemption from those tariffs. The CCP then takes advantage of that, right? And so in order to close that loophole, the US and Mexico are agreeing to have it where, hey, you want to get around this, we have to prove that you actually smelted it, that it actually came from you. Now, BBC had a bit more on this. They said the measures expand protections for U.S. steel and aluminum makers that were launched under Mr. Trump in 2018 in the name of national security. Remember, Donald Trump was talking about American steel, right? They note the tariffs that Trump put in place set a 25% tax on steel and 10% tax on aluminum imports, and they were controversial, sparking trade battles with countries all around the world. They note that Mexico, one of America's largest trade partners, was among the countries to eventually win an exemption from the rules. And the White House said it decided to revisit the exemption from Mexico as an increase of imports from the country suggested it was being used as a stopping point to bypass the taxes. And it's only about 13% of the steel imported from Mexico last year, and only 6% of aluminum originated from outside of North America, according to officials. But officials said the rules were aimed at heading off a further increase as China's flagging domestic economy leads firms to look abroad. In other words, the amount of steel and aluminum coming from China through Mexico, it's technically not the majority. It's still a lot. But they're concerned that because the CCP has an issue of overcapacity right now, that it would increase that and use that, of course, as a way to bypass the tariffs and the taxes. Now, on this as well, the CCP's unfair trade practices and its use of loopholes to get around tariffs are actually causing some really serious concerns for the industry overall. I'll be talking about this after I come back from a quick break.